Hello and welcome into another episode of Locked On Wolves. Today on the show, we're going to talk a little trade deadline. We're here just 3 weeks or so, just a little under 3 weeks away from the deadline. A couple of names out there the Timberwolves have been mentioned as potentially interested in. I want to talk a little bit about that and what's the likelihood of the Wolves actually making a significant move at the deadline. And then also a quick preview of the gaming on Sunday between the Timberwolves and the Brooklyn Nets. We'll look at the last time these two teams matched up, what's changed since then, and what to expect on Sunday evening. It's all upcoming on the show. Welcome in. You are Locked On Wolves.
You are Locked On Timberwolves, your daily Minnesota Timberwolves podcast. Part of the Locked On Podcast Network. Your team every day.
Hello and welcome into the Locked On Wolves podcast, part of the Locked On Podcast Network, your team every day. My name is Ben Beecken. I'm the host of Locked On Wolves. I'm also the editor of Dunking with Wolves, the Timberwolves site on the Fansided Network. Happy Friday, everybody. Happy weekend. And we got a big show upcoming here today. We're talking a little trade deadline. We're going to talk a little Wolves Nets. It's all upcoming on the show. First of all, thank you for making Locked On Wolves your first listen each and every day. Locked On Wolves is, of course, free and available everywhere, including YouTube, as well as all of your favorite audio channels, Apple, Google, Spotify, and, of course, the all-new Odyssey app. You can also follow the show on Twitter at Locked On T-Wolves, and my account is at Beecken with two B's, two E's, C-K-E-N. All right, today on the show, we're just under 3 weeks away from the trade deadline. So I want to talk about a couple of names that the Timberwolves have been kind of I guess, tangentially mentioned as a potential trade suitor. Nothing, obviously, no major rumors. We're still at the stage where it's like, oh, this many teams have called and had interest in such and such player. And so we're not really drilling down into front runners for anybody at this point. Nothing's about to happen. But there's some names that could fit the Wolves roster. The Wolves obviously still have some holes that they're looking to fill, and very clearly should be, at the very least, a play-in team in the Western Conference, looking to make the jump from a 7, 8, 9 team to potentially like the 5 or the 6 or maybe even the 5 seed down the road in the Western Conference. So we'll talk about that first. Then I want to get into the matchup against the Brooklyn Nets on Sunday. Obviously, the Nets look very different with Kyrie Irving in the fold, and also now Kevin Durant injured. The Timberwolves, the last time they played the Nets, did not have Karl-Anthony Towns. That was way back when Towns had the tailbone contusion following the injury in Washington during the game that preceded the Wolves visiting Brooklyn. So these teams look a little different, and the Wolves still battled the Nets down to the wire the last time they faced them. So I want to revisit that, talk about the matchup, what to expect in Wolves Nets on Sunday. So we'll do all that here today. Let's start with the trade stuff. So first of all, in terms of the likelihood of the Wolves making a trade, it's been a little while since we talked about this. So I want to kind of rehash my thoughts on this. The Timberwolves don't have that many trade-friendly pieces. The problem with the Wolves is their top trade assets are their two best players, of course, Karl-Anthony Towns, Anthony Edwards, or at least their two best players / biggest upside. We could argue whether Edwards or Russell's the more effective player right here today, all things considered. But in terms of trade value, obviously Edwards has more value than D'Angelo Russell. So they have two players that have a ton of value in Towns and Edwards. Neither of them are going to be traded. D'Angelo Russell is a good player who's overpaid with 1 year left on his deal following this year. So it's unclear what kind of trade value he would have, or even if he'd even be worth trading. It's unlikely the Wolves would get enough back for him because remember, they've got to match the salary, right? So unless the Wolves are getting back another max player, well, there aren't very many max players that are worse than D'Angelo Russell, right? I'm not saying D'Angelo Russell is bad, but there aren't very many guys who have similar salaries that are going to have teams are going to be willing to give up for D'Angelo Russell, I guess is probably a better way to say it. So I don't know that he's got much trade value. I'm pretty confident he doesn't have that much trade value, and he's probably worth more to the Wolves and his pairing with Karl-Anthony Towns than he would be on some other teams. And then on the flip side, you've got a bunch of these young players that are very valuable based on their contracts, but there's no reason for the Wolves to move them for exactly that reason. They're not going to trade Naz Reid or Jalen Noel because why would they? They're good players on very, very reasonable, only partially guaranteed salaries, and they each have a year left. They're not trading Jared Vanderbilt. He's a steal on his contract. So, they've got these guys that are exactly what you're looking for, right? The whole reason you make an undrafted signing like Naz Reid and give him a partially guaranteed contract, or you select the Jalen Noel in the second round, is for that cost certainty of, hey, we've got a rotation guy for under $2 million a season. the Wolves hit on both of those guys. Credit to the Gerson Rosas regime for that. And obviously Sachin Gupta is part of that. So they're not going anywhere. So who's in the middle? That leaves us with players who probably don't have any trade value, like a Jake Layman, right? And then you've got who is by the way, excuse me, an expiring deal. He's I think 4 million expiring after this year. So there's this much trade value in terms of a throw in a trade. But then you've got your Jaden McDaniels, who's in his second year, of course, has a couple more years after this one of team control on his rookie deal. He's got some upside. That's going to be, whatever team is interested in him. There's going to be some teams that don't feel like he has that much trade value. There's going to be other teams that feel like he could have a starter, maybe even star level caliber upside. And so you have to find the right trade partner who thinks that McDaniels can do that. Reasonable contract as a late first round pick. So he certainly has trade value. Malik Beasley coming into the season, one would have thought he had a pretty significant amount of trade value, despite the off the court issues and the injury last year in a Timberwolves uniform. And last year included, after he signed the contract extension, he was lights out from beyond the arc, an effective transition player, good in the half court and as a catch and shoot player. So there was an assumption he had some trade value. I think he still does, but how much, that remains to be seen. So Beasley and McDaniels, those are probably your most prominent ones in the middle. Patrick Beverley, an expiring contract, obviously would have trade value, but why would the Wolves trade him when they're smack dab in the middle of that, 6 to 10 range in the Western Conference? And they very clearly should be, at least in the play. And why would you trade a guy who's obviously helped transform your culture and your defense on a reasonable contract? I mean, yeah, you could trade him and get an asset back, but what's more valuable, making the playoffs with Towns and Edwards and possibly making some noise in the first round, or maybe even getting out of the play-in altogether and getting to the 6th seed, or trading him for a future pick. I mean, I don't think the Wolves are likely to trade Beverley unless it's part of a much, much bigger deal. And then the last one obviously would be Taurean Prince, who is an expiring contract, probably has some value as a rotational guy, or at the very least as a $13 million expiring contract. And I guess we should mention Josh Okogie, same idea, only a $4 million deal, but he's expiring, probably has a little bit of value, but certainly not as a standalone trade piece. So the Wolves just have a weird roster when it comes to trying to craft a trade. They've got a lot of these pieces that are too valuable to trade on their small salaries, guys that are too good to trade on their max salaries, a max salary that you're probably not able to trade, and a few guys that are in between, but don't carry much value on their own. So when the Wolves go to try and make a trade, you have to find the exact right trade partner. And in a lot of these cases, especially as we start to talk about bigger names or rebuilding teams that are looking to, like the Philadelphia 76ers and Ben Simmons are a very different case than, say, the Detroit Pistons and Jerami Grant. Obviously, Simmons is the better player, but they're different potential trade partners. And the Indiana Pacers are probably somewhere in the middle, right? They're a team that underachieved. They feel like they should be better. They think they're closer to being what they want to be than the Pistons, but they're not at the level of the Sixers. So the trade partner that you're going to do the dance with obviously has to align with your goals or you have to be able to meet each other's goals in order to make this work. Obviously, that's why it's a trade partner. But in a lot of these cases, a third team would be needed to help get that trade partner what they might need. And I want to get into that a little bit with a couple of these. So there's two names I want to discuss that the Timberwolves have been basically mentioned as well, one of them actually, and the other one a player who they used to be interested in who is now available. So I want to talk about both those guys next before we get to Wolves Nets and that preview here a little bit later. First, though, let's talk about our friends over at betonline.ag. BetOnline would like to wish you a happy new betting year as we continue our march to the playoffs. Well, now we are in the playoffs in the NFL, but more than halfway through the NBA season as well. BetOnline remains the number one spot for all the best sports wagering action for 2022. It's a new year and a new updated desktop and mobile website. To sign up today and receive your 50% welcome bonus on your first deposit, just use our promo code LOCKEDON to get started. From football to basketball, hockey to boxing, and UFC, right on down to your favorite Vegas casino games. Don't wait to take advantage of all the amazing offers available for 2022. BetOnline is the fastest and easiest way to wager on all your favorite sports. BetOnline, where the game starts. One more time, that promo code is locked on for a 50% welcome bonus on your first deposit at betonline.ag. All right. Again, I thank you for making Locked On Wolves your first listen each and every day. And a reminder that for your next listen, you should check out Locked On Now. The Locked On Now podcast has nightly recaps of every NBA game with analysis from our local experts. Listen to Locked On now on Apple Podcasts, Spotify, or wherever you like to listen. You can also watch it on the Locked On NBA YouTube channel. All right, couple names out there. So one I want to talk about as a trade target is Jerami Grant. Now, he's obviously one of the more coveted trade targets that's out there because of his combination of relative youth, his obviously his ability, the fact he's got 1 year left on his deal. Now he's injured. He's been out for a little over a month. He actually, I think, is supposed to be reevaluated really soon in terms of when he should be able to start, returning to action in terms of taking contact and getting on the court and playing 5-on-5 and all that stuff. So he is hurt, but he's expected to be back soon. It's a thumb injury, so it's not anything, too crazy that should be long term. But there's a lot of teams in on him. So Jake Fisher of Bleacher Report just reported the other day he had a whole list of teams: Lakers, Blazers, Knicks, Jazz, Wizards, Celtics, Pacers, Timberwolves, Kings. What is that? 9 teams are teams that have signaled some level of interest in Grant, who of course is with the Pistons right now. The Wolves had been interested in him in him in restricted free agency a couple of summers ago when he left Denver and ultimately signed the offer sheet with Detroit. The Timberwolves were one of 3, maybe 4 teams that were reportedly very seriously considering trying to assign him to an offer sheet. Now the cap would have been rough for Minnesota, and that's probably at least partially what hindered that from happening. So Grant ended up going to Detroit. Now there's going to be stiff competition for him, and of all those teams I just listed, I mean, there's really only a couple that are strong playoff teams, right? I mean, you look at the Jazz, obviously, the Wizards are going to make the playoffs. The Celtics should in the East, but the rest of them, and I guess the Lakers too. Although I don't know what the Lakers are giving up to get Jerami Grant. But you're looking at other teams who are also always mentioned in the Ben Simmons sweepstakes, looking for younger, up and coming type players. Now, in Grant's case, it's a little bit weird because he's a free agent after next season. So, what would the Kings acquiring Jerami Grant do unless they plan to extend him in relatively short order? The tricky thing with Grant, though, and shifting this to talking a little bit more about who he is as a player, is that while he's been very good in Detroit, he was a 22 point per game scorer last year. He's over 20 points. He was over 20 points per game this year pre-injury. Is that he seems to have been a little bit overextended in Detroit as a higher usage player. He's best cast as your third, fourth option, ideally, as kind of a, a, a souped up version of a 3-and-D wing from a few years ago, right? He can do more than that. And he's not exactly a sharpshooter from outside the arc, certainly hasn't been in Detroit, but he can do a little bit of everything, and he's a switchable defender and is bouncy and exactly who you'd want to pair next to Karl-Anthony Towns. In his 1 year in Denver, he only played 27 minutes a game, only scored 12 points a game, but he shot 39% from 3 and was a really good defender for them. So then he goes to Detroit. He ends up playing 34 minutes a game last season. He shoots only 35% from 3, just 43% from the field, while scoring 22 points per game. And, depending on which metrics you look at, his defense suffered a little bit in Detroit last year as well. Now, obviously, that wasn't a good team, so there's other factors there. But you look at this year, which has been, only 24 games for him because of the injury, but his turnover rate is up. His shooting percentages are down once again, down to just 33% from 3 and 41% from the field. This is his age 27 season. He turns 28, I guess, in a couple of months here in mid-March. But you're looking at a player who's just coming into his prime, probably his best cast as that third or fourth best player on a good team. And there's still a lot of value there. And so a team like Minnesota, who has their Towns and has their Edwards, and at least for now has D'Angelo Russell, it makes sense to acquire a guy like Grant who could slide into that 4 spot. That way, then Jared Vanderbilt can be your big off the bench that can play the 4, that you can play an ultra big lineup and slide Jerami Grant to the 3 and play Vanderbilt at the 4. The other option is you could slide Patrick Beverley back to the bench, and obviously Pat Bev's not a long-term starter for this team. So then you're starting D'Angelo Russell, Anthony Edwards, Grant at the 3, Vanderbilt at the 4, and Towns at the 5. A really long, athletic, defense-first lineup with some additional shooting as well. Now, Beverley's generally a great three-point shooter too. He's actually been better for his career than Jerami Grant, but it adds some additional size and positional flexibility and athleticism, really, by adding Grant to the starting lineup. So what would the Pistons need for Jerami Grant? That's a really tough question, and that's where, of course, I think this would break down for Minnesota. I mean, what are you trading for Jerami Grant? What do the Pistons want? They're going to want draft picks. The Wolves have all of their picks plus a couple of extra second rounders upcoming. So it would almost have to be like a Jaden McDaniels, but remember, McDaniels doesn't make very much money. His salary is what, 2 million, and of course he's got 2 more years after this one. But how do you make that salary work when Jeremy Grant is making 20 million? He's owed just under 21 million next year. So Jaden McDaniels and a pick, and then you've got to include Malik Beasley. So Beasley, McDaniels, and a pick would get it done in terms of salary. Would the Pistons accept that with just one first round pick? Or maybe, I mean, you could do Jaden McDaniels, Torian Prince, and another player. Prince makes less money than Beasley, so you'd have to have a third player involved, plus a pick or two. So McDaniels, Prince, Okogie, or McDaniels, Prince. Maybe you could do McDaniels, Prince, and Leandro Balmaro plus one pick, and that gets it done. I mean, that's a lot to give up, but Detroit also is going to have many suitors for Jerami Grant. So if you're serious about the Wolves getting him, you have to give something to get something. I don't know that Beasley has much value at all to Detroit. He shouldn't, at least. But there's two possibilities there. One, they let him play out the year, put up some big numbers in the starting lineup for Detroit as one of their top options, play with Cade Cunningham, all that good stuff. And then trade him in the offseason as he recoups his trade value, hopefully. Or there's a third team involved and Beasley goes to that third team. The Pistons get a pick or two from that third team. So Minnesota's only having to give up maybe one pick. That third team gives a pick or two to get Jerami Grant. The Pistons get 2 or 3 picks back. They're trading Jerami Grant. They're also getting back Jaden McDaniels. Beasley goes to said third team. I didn't dig into what teams that could be, but I mean, think of any fringe playoff contender or any playoff contender that could stomach taking on Beasley's salary as a 6th, 7th man type. And then the Pistons win by getting their picks. The Wolves would win by getting Jerami Grant. That to me is the most realistic scenario for how Malik Beasley, or excuse me, how Jerami Grant ends up in Minnesota. I think that's more likely than what I would consider kind of a less than appetizing platter of Jaden McDaniels, Torian Prince, and say Josh Okogie plus a pick or two. I don't think that gets Detroit out of bed. So I think it's going to have to be a 3-team deal where Beasley plus McDaniels are both going out. That's probably something I would do. I have not been as high on Jaden McDaniels as some people have been. And I think Jerami Grant's really good. In fact, I think Jerami Grant is kind of more of a fully realized, a best case fully realized Jaden McDaniels. I could accept that Jaden McDaniels has a ceiling that's higher than Jerami Grant, but I think the best case, most likely scenario for McDaniels is something similar to Jerami Grant. He's a little longer, a little bit of a probably a higher ceiling as a defender, but Grant is a little bit of a better offensive player. Well, certainly now, but I think even a couple of years ago, you look back to his Oklahoma City year a few years ago, a little more polished, certainly, than Jaden McDaniels. And we're talking about a Wolves team that wants to make the playoffs now. So if I'm Minnesota, I would trade McDaniels, Beasley, and a first rounder to get a year and a half of Jerami Grant and the opportunity to re-sign him. I think that would be an attractive move. So if I'm Minnesota, I push for that. Again, I think you do need a third team, but he is a potential realistic trade target. The other name I wanted to mention is Paul Millsap. This came out on Thursday, I think, that the Nets are going to work with Millsap to find a trade. Of course, he signed with Brooklyn on a veterans minimum deal to try and win a championship. I talked a lot about him in the offseason, as I said basically exactly this, both on the show, and I also wrote about it at Dunking with Wolves, that Millsap's a perfect fit for Minnesota. We knew that the Timberwolves had recruited him in free agency several years ago when Tom Thibodeau was in the front office. The Wolves were interested this summer, and I think we're one of the last 2 or 3 teams rumored to be in the running for him. Ultimately, Millsap took the vet minimum to go to Brooklyn. The Wolves had a little bit more money to offer him, but ultimately ended up re-signing Jared Vanderbilt anyway. The rumors that are out there for Millsap involve, your usual suspects in terms of potential championship contenders like the Golden State Warriors. Some other teams mentioned the Bulls, the Clippers. I would think the Clippers would be less appealing at this moment in time, and the Bulls now with the Lonzo Ball injury. I mean, still an attractive landing spot, I would think, for Millsap. Certainly the Warriors. I don't know that he gets as much opportunity with the Warriors in terms of minutes. If he came to Minnesota, he would certainly be a rotation big. And the Wolves would have to figure out, does this mean that, Nas plays less minutes? Does it mean that that McDaniels plays even more at the 3? Does it mean that that Vanderbilt gets some minutes at the 3 with Millsap and Towns? Which would obviously be a little bit challenging in terms of spacing. But the theory behind Millsap is obviously he's very old at this point. What is he, like 37, I think? But I mean, Millsap can still defend multiple positions. He can still stretch the floor a little bit, and he can still make all the passes necessary in Chris Finch's offense. He's still a decent rebounder, and he would add some of that veteran toughness to the team. And if nothing else, be another veteran presence. I believe he overlapped briefly with Chris Finch in Denver. They may have missed each other by a year. But Denver, I mean, what he did in Denver for them is similar to what the Timberwolves would ask of him. Minnesota does some things similarly on both ends of the floor, offense and defense, to what Denver has done over the past few years. So Millsap would still be a really seamless fit in Minnesota. I would expect the Timberwolves to inquire on him. And at this point, it's going to be a trade, right? So the only reason that some of these other teams could end up just getting him for the vet minimum is if they end up waiving him. Between now and the deadline, it's obviously in the Nets' best interest to try and see what they can get for him. If it's a couple of second rounders at a vet minimum contract, the Wolves wouldn't really need to send anything back. So, if you got a couple extra second rounders lying around, and the Wolves do, send a couple of those out and see if you can get Paul Millsap. And I'm not sure if that's going to be enough. If Chicago and the Warriors and some of these other teams are bidding, who knows, maybe the Lakers. But the Timberwolves should have a shot at getting Paul Millsap. If he ends up getting a free agency, if the Nets don't trade him, if they end up waiving him, then it's going to be a little bit trickier. But as of now, Minnesota would be an attractive landing spot for Paul Millsap. And I still think he's got enough. He still did good things for Denver last year. In fact, I was surprised when they basically decided to replace him with Jeff Green. I thought that was a mistake. And Paul Millsap has just kind of fallen out of the rotation in Brooklyn. I think he's still got something left and would be a great fit in Minnesota. Okay. Let's close the show by looking at Wolves Nets and what to expect on Sunday night at Target Center. Before we do that, though, let's talk about our great friends over at Built Bar. It's the new year, and that means New Year's resolutions. If yours is about getting fit or eating healthier, make sure that you include Built Bar in your plan. Built Bar is the protein bar that tastes like a candy bar. Built Bar makes it easier to stick to your resolution because it tastes so good, you'll want to eat it. Unlike other protein bars, which can be chalky or waxy or taste like a chemical spill, you want to eat healthy, but it just gets so boring. By like week 3, you might be thinking this is not worth it. Where is the chocolate? Well, Built Bar has you covered because Built Bars are covered in 100% real chocolate. Most Built Bars contain 130 calories, 4 grams of sugar, just 4 net carbs, and 17 grams of protein. Compare that to a candy bar, which usually has around 240 calories, 30 grams of sugar, and dozens of net carbs. Here's an idea for the new year. Go to all your secret treat stashes at home, in the pantry, at the office, in the car, wherever. Throw out all the sugary or calorie-filled treats and replace them with Built Bars. So when you're craving a snack or a treat, you can reach for something that's healthy and tastes incredible. Even if you're not a huge fan of working out, you can at least eat something that tastes good and is good for you. That way, when you enjoy a delicious Built Bar, you can almost count it as a workout. There's so many flavors to choose from: coconut almond, peanut butter brownie, raspberry, cookies and cream, salted caramel, mint brownie, and many, many more. In fact, Built is always coming out with new limited time flavors. So check out Built.com often to see what's new. Go to Built.com, use promo code LOCK15 and get 15% off your order. That's promo code LOCK15 for 15% off at Built.com. All right, let's talk Wolves Nets. So the last time the Timberwolves saw Brooklyn was it right? I think it was right before Thanksgiving, if I'm not mistaken. And Kevin Durant played. Obviously, Kyrie Irving was still not playing. James Harden played. So really, I guess outside of this was shortly after the Joe Harris injury. So no Joe Harris, no Kyrie Irving. Right after Blake Griffin had gotten removed from the rotation. This was right after Karl-Anthony Towns bruised his tailbone in Washington. Minnesota had fallen to 500. They were at 11-10, kind of riding high. Towns gets hurt in Washington. Disappointing loss. Obviously, the Wizards are better than expected this year, but still disappointing loss. A game the Timberwolves could have won. They go to Brooklyn at 11-11, take on the Nets, and play them really tough. They were up 7 at the end of the first quarter. They were only down 4 at halftime. Down 1 heading into the fourth quarter, close down the stretch. They're within a bucket, within 3 points in the final 30 seconds or so. They just need a stop to get a chance to tie it. Durant hits a tough shot to extend the lead to 5 points, and the Nets win by 5. What was different about the Timberwolves then? Well, Taurean Prince was in the starting lineup on this night. Now, of course, that was because Towns was out. Well, actually, no, Naz Reid was in the starting lineup because there was no Towns. Taurean Prince was in the starting lineup at the 3 in this game. And Jared Vanderbilt was... So Jaden McDaniels was out. McDaniels was hurt, I guess, for this game too, because he didn't play at all. I forgot there was like a knee thing or something where he missed a couple of games. So Vanderbilt and Prince both started in this game, as did Naz Reid. Naz had a good game, 19-7, shot 7 of 14. D'Angelo Russell struggled with shooting the ball a little bit in his old stomping grounds at Barclays Center. Malik Beasley, 18 points on 19 shots off the bench. Interestingly, Leandro Bolmaro was in the rotation. This is when he had that short stint where he played quite a bit. He played 25 minutes and was a plus 19 in this game. There were only 3 Timberwolves players that had positive plus minuses. Nathan Knight in 14 minutes was a plus 5. Jared Vanderbilt in 30 minutes was a plus 3. And Leandro Bolmaro was a plus 19 in 25 minutes in a 5-point loss to the Nets for the Wolves. So weird rotation. You'll notice that Jalen Noel, of course, was not in the rotation in this game. And he very much so is now in the rotation for the Timberwolves. And he's now off the injury report as well after he missed the one game, came back and played a couple since the ankle sprain about 10 days ago. So he's off the injury report. Patrick Beverley's questionable with the ankle tweak that he suffered the other night against on Wednesday night. So relatively healthy for the Timberwolves. The Nets, of course, do not have Kevin Durant. Kevin Durant is out with the knee issue. They do have Kyrie Irving. They do have James Harden and all the other usual suspects. No Joe Harris, no Kevin Durant. As a team, the Nets are solid defensively. They're good on offense, but they're an interesting offense. They're not a good 3-point shooting team. Well, they're kind of middle of the pack at best. They don't shoot a ton of threes. In terms of attempts, a 3-point attempt rate, they're 26th in the league. They're 14th in terms of percentage at the 3-point line, or behind the 3-point line, I should say. They are 10th in pace. They like to play relatively fast, but they're comfortable playing a variety of different ways because they don't have a problem just shooting twos, trying to get to the free throw line. That's obviously what James Harden does. Harden, by the way, shooting a career worst from outside the arc, 33.5% on more than 7 attempts per game. He's still, of course, averaging 22 points, 10 assists, 8 rebounds per game, but the efficiency isn't quite the same for James Harden as it once was. And so that's notable. So, what to look for in this game? Both teams want to play fast. The Timberwolves would rather shoot more threes. They did a pretty good job on James Harden the last time these teams played. I mean, he had 20 points, but he only shot 4 of 11, did a lot of his damage at the free throw line. He also turned it over 6 times. So Josh Okogie probably will get some of that time. I'd be surprised if Bolmaro got called up from the G League and played in this game, but obviously he did fairly well last time with an occasional Harden matchup. No Patrick Beverley would hurt in a game where you've got to try and contend with obviously Harden, but also, I mean, Kyrie Irving. Patty Mills is really good as well. So the Nets have several players on the perimeter that you got to look out for. And the Timberwolves, if they're down Patrick Beverley, they're going to be in a tough spot going up against this backcourt. Certainly a game that Minnesota could win in terms of what Brooklyn's been up to. I mean, most recently they actually just lost at the Wizards by 1, and overall have just kind of treaded water since Durant got hurt. They've been alternating wins and losses now for the last 2 weeks, quite literally since January 5th. They've gone win, loss, win, loss, win, loss, win, loss, win. And they've lost some bad ones. I mean, they lost to the Thunder by 21. They lost to the Blazers by 6. Both of those are really bad losses. And then they've beaten some decent teams. They've beaten the Bulls. Beating the Wizards is a solid win as well. That was on Wednesday. So they've been a little bit up and down, and this will be game game 4 of a 4-game road trip. In between recording this on late Thursday, early Friday, and the game on Sunday, the Spurs will take on, the Nets will take on the Spurs Friday night. So they will have one more game between now and then, but the Wolves are off Friday and Saturday. So they'll be waiting at home for Brooklyn, who will be on 1-day rest on the final night of a road trip. So this would be a game where I wouldn't be surprised to see the Nets only favored by a couple of points at Target Center with no Kevin Durant, maybe a 1.5, because the Wolves, again, have generally been playing better. We'll have the rest advantage and we'll be at home. Certainly a winnable game for Minnesota. We'll, of course, do the post-game pod right after the game on Sunday, and that will post late Sunday and be Monday's show. So make sure that you're following and subscribed to Locked On Wolves. And thank you for making Locked On Wolves your first listen each and every day. Of course, the show is free and available everywhere, including YouTube, Apple, Google, Spotify, and the all-new Odyssey app. You can also follow on Twitter at Locked On T-Wolves and at Beecken with 2 B's, 2 E's, CKEN. That's all we have for you today. Thanks again for listening to Locked On Wolves, part of the Locked On Podcast Network. Remember, the Locked On Network is your local experts on all the biggest stories. And again, thanks for making Locked On Wolves your first listen. A reminder that your second listen can be Locked On Bets. It's your daily one-stop shop for all your gambling needs. Locked On Bets, hosted by your boy Q, with expert analysis and insight from Lee Sterling. It's free and available on all platforms. Once again, I'm Ben Beecken. This is the Locked On Wolves podcast, and we'll catch you next time.